The Huntington-Pierce merger would create the largest financial empire on the East Coast, possibly in all of America. The only thing standing in its way was a signature, Alexander Pierce's signature, on a marriage certificate. "This is absurd," Alexander hissed, slamming his fist onto the polished mahogany desk that had belonged to his father, and his grandfather before that. The penthouse office overlooking Manhattan shimmered with morning light, but the atmosphere inside was stormy. "We're in 2025, not the Middle Ages. I won't marry someone I've never met just to please shareholders." Winston Pierce, Alexander's father, remained unmoved. His silver hair caught the sunlight as he gazed out at the skyline, a kingdom he had helped build brick by brick, deal by hostile deal. The Huntingtons have made their terms clear. Old money meets new technology. Their historical influence, our innovative edge. Your marriage to Victoria Huntington seals the deal in a way that makes both families look united, not just their portfolios. Winston turned, his steel blue eyes, so like his son's, locking onto Alexander. "And might I remind you that your last 3 relationships have made page 6 for all the wrong reasons?" Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 34, he was Business Insider's most eligible tech billionaire, 3 years running. Women threw themselves at him. Men wanted to be him. The problem wasn't finding someone to date. It was finding someone who saw past the Pierce fortune and the sculpted jawline that graced magazine covers. "I have 6 months until the merger finalizes," Alexander countered. "That's 6 months. To find another solution." Winston smiled thinly. "The engagement announcement goes out next week. You'll meet Victoria at the charity gala on Friday. I suggest you bring your most charming self." After his father left, Alexander loosened his tie and poured himself 3 fingers of 30-year-old scotch. Too early? Perhaps. Necessary? Absolutely. His phone buzzed with a text from his best friend and CFO, James Woodhouse. "James, heard about the arranged marriage. Medieval, bro. Need an escape plan?" Alexander smiled wryly. James, with his state school education and self-made millions, had always been Alexander's link to reality, outside the bubble of generational wealth. "Alexander, meet me at Sullivan's. I need a drink with someone who isn't trying to auction me off." Across town, in a cramped apartment above a noisy bodega in Queens, Ellie Morgan was having a crisis of her own. "The boiler's completely shot," her landlord announced, chewing on a toothpick as he surveyed the flooded bathroom. "Gonna take at least 2 weeks to replace." Ellie pushed her glasses up her nose, mentally calculating her bank balance. "And the rent reduction for those 2 weeks will be..." The landlord barked out a laugh. "Sweetheart, in this market, I got 3 people waiting to take this place if you don't want it." After he left, Ellie slumped onto her second-hand couch, which sagged in all the wrong places. At 28, she had a master's degree in art history, crushing student debt and a job at the Metropolitan Museum that barely covered her bills. Her roommate had moved out last month, leaving Ellie scrambling to cover the full rent. Her phone pinged with a notification. Museum staff chat reminder. All staff needed for Friday's charity gala. Black tie mandatory. No exceptions. Ellie groaned. Another night of serving champagne to the ultra-wealthy while they pretended to care about art preservation. And now, she needed to find something to wear. Her phone rang. Her sister, Kate. "Please tell me you're calling with good news," Ellie answered. "Even better," Kate chirped. "I'm calling with an opportunity. The catering company I work for needs extra servers for a bachelor party tonight. It's at Sullivan's. You know, that swanky bar downtown. 300 cash, 1 night." Ellie sat up straighter. 300? I'll be there. "Great. Oh, and..." "Ellie, wear something attractive. It's for some finance bros." Ellie rolled her eyes but agreed. $300 was $300, and with her boiler situation, she couldn't afford to be picky. What she didn't know was that in just a few hours, she would be serving drinks to Alexander Pierce. the man whose engagement would be announced at the very gala she was working that Friday. The man who, despite all his billions, was feeling just as trapped as she was, and neither had any idea how their worlds were about to collide. Sullivan's wasn't just a bar, it was an institution. Wood-paneled walls absorbed the secrets of Wall Street's elite, while bartenders mixed drinks that cost more than Ellie's weekly grocery budget. "Remember," Kate whispered as they entered through the service entrance, "these guys tip well if you laugh at their jokes and pretend their investment strategies are fascinating." Ellie adjusted her borrowed black dress, a size too small and about 3 inches too short for her comfort. "I have 2 art history degrees. I can fake interest in anything." The private room at the back of Sullivan's had been reserved for what the manager described as Mr. Woodhouse and Associates. Ellie was assigned to their table, a responsibility that came with a stern warning. "These are VIPs. Don't spill, don't eavesdrop, and for God's sake, don't ask for autographs." Alexander arrived at Sullivan's in a mood darker than his custom. Tom Ford suit. The impending arranged marriage felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He spotted James already seated in their usual private room, 2 glasses of scotch waiting. "To your impending nuptials," James toasted with a smirk. "May your corporate merger be long and your prenup airtight." Alexander glowered. "I haven't agreed to anything yet. Your father issued a press release an hour ago. Congratulations, you're officially engaged to—" James checked his phone. "The luminous Victoria Huntington, whose family's distinguished banking legacy perfectly complements the innovative vision of Pierce Technologies." Alexander grabbed the scotch and drained it. "I need another." As if summoned by his desperation, Ellie appeared at their table, tray balanced expertly on one hand. "Gentlemen, would you like another round?" she asked, her practiced server smile firmly in place. Alexander glanced up, irritated at the interruption, and froze. The woman before him wasn't the typical Sullivan server. Behind her glasses, her eyes sparkled with intelligence. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a graceful neck and determined jawline. Most strikingly, she looked at him without a hint of recognition or fawning. "I'll have whatever makes Billionaire arranged marriages seem like a good idea," Alexander said dryly. Ellie's eyebrow arched. "So, tequila then? The kind that makes you forget your own name, much less your fiancé's?" James choked on his drink, eyes widening at her boldness. Instead of being offended, Alexander let out a genuine laugh, the first of the day. "Make it a double." As Ellie turned to leave, Alexander called after her. "What's your name?" "Ellie," she answered, then added, with a small smile, "though I doubt you'll remember it after that tequila." When she returned with their drinks, Alexander noticed her hands were slightly calloused, not the manicured smoothness he was accustomed to. She worked hard, this Ellie. "So, Ellie," he said, rolling her name on his tongue like he was tasting an expensive wine. "What's your story? You don't seem like a career server. And you don't seem like a man who typically cares about server biographies," she countered, setting down his tequila. "But since you asked, I have a master's in art history, crushing student debt, and a leak in my apartment. This," she gestured around the opulent room, "is my side hustle." "Art history?" Alexander perked up. "The Met or the MoMA?" Surprise flickered across Ellie's face. "The Met. Junior curator, though my actual title is administrative assistant, 'cause they can pay me less that way." "Alexander," James interrupted, "we should discuss the Hong Kong acquisition before you get completely wasted." Alexander waved him off, his attention fixed on Ellie. "What's your specialty?" "Renaissance restoration," she replied, curiosity getting the better of her. "How do you know the difference between museum departments?" "Pierce Technologies provides the security systems for both institutions," Alexander said, purposely omitting that his family foundation was also the Met's largest donor. "I've spent a lot of time in museums." Something about Ellie intrigued him. Perhaps it was her unimpressed demeanor, or the way she spoke about her passion despite her circumstances. Either way, for the first time that day, he wasn't thinking about his impending engagement. "Your tequila's getting warm," she pointed out, breaking the moment. "And I have other tables." As she walked away, James leaned forward. "Please tell me you're not hitting on the server while your engagement announcement is being drafted." Alexander's eyes followed Ellie's retreating form. "I was making conversation." "Uh-huh. Just like you were making conversation with that Olympic swimmer last year, the one who ended up on page 6? "This is different," Alexander insisted, though he wasn't sure why. Across the room, Ellie was having a similar conversation with Kate. "Was that Alexander Pierce you were just talking?" "Dewey," Kate hissed. "As in Pierce Technologies, as in Forbes 30 under 40 cover model?" Ellie glanced back at the private table. "That's Alexander Pierce? I thought he'd be more godlike, intimidating." "The internet certainly thinks so." Kate pulled out her phone, showing Ellie a business magazine cover featuring Alexander in a tailored suit, looking every inch the corporate titan. "He's getting married," Ellie said dismissively. "Arranged merger marriage or something equally medieval. Not that it matters. Men like that don't date women who serve them drinks. Men like that don't usually ask for women's life stories either," Kate pointed out. "And he couldn't take his eyes off you." Ellie rolled her eyes. "He's probably just surprised to meet someone who didn't immediately ask for a selfie or his net worth." As the night progressed, Alexander ordered 2 more rounds, each time requesting that Ellie deliver them. Each brief interaction revealed more: his surprising knowledge of Italian Renaissance painters, her passion project researching overlooked female artists, his dry wit that matched her sarcasm beat for beat. By closing time, Alexander had James make a discreet inquiry about Ellie's schedule. "She works at the Met during the day," James reported back, "and will be working the charity gala on Friday night." Alexander smiled. The same gala where he was supposed to meet his future wife. "Interesting coincidence." "Alex," James warned, "whatever you're thinking, stop. Your father will disown you if you mess up this merger." "I'm just making a new friend," Alexander replied innocently. "A friend who happens to be knowledgeable about art and will be at an event I'm dreading." "Right," James sighed. "A friend who has no idea you're about to become engaged or that you're worth billions." As they left, Alexander dropped a business card with a handwritten note alongside a $500 tip for Ellie. The note read simply, "Renaissance conversation to be continued. Friday." Ellie found it after they left, staring at the card, in disbelief. Part of her, the practical, debt-ridden part, was thrilled with the tip. Another part, the one with dignity and principles, was insulted by what felt like a proposition. But the smallest part, the part she tried hardest to ignore, was intrigued by the possibility of seeing him again. "Definitely trouble," she murmured, yet she tucked the card into her purse instead of the trash. What she didn't know was just how complicated Friday would become. Friday arrived with the kind of perfect early summer weather that made Manhattan feel magical. At least, to those who could afford to enjoy it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed for the annual Preservation Gala, its grand entrance lined with a red carpet where photographers jostled for position. Ellie had been at work since dawn, her usual curator duties abandoned in favor of crisis management. A priceless vase had been positioned too close to an air vent. The caterer had questions about where to set up. The florist had delivered lilies instead of roses, triggering the event planner's allergies. "Morgan," her supervisor called. "The director needs all hands on deck for greeting the Pierce Huntington party. Apparently, there's going to be some big announcement tonight." Ellie froze. "Pierce? As in Alexander Pierce?" "The very same. Word is he's announcing his engagement to Victoria Huntington tonight." Her supervisor leaned in conspiratorially. "Biggest merger on Wall Street in a decade, and they're sealing it with a wedding. Old school." The business card in Ellie's pocket suddenly felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. Engagement? He'd flirted with her, asked to see her. Again, all while he was about to announce an engagement. "Are you okay?" her supervisor asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Fine, Ellie managed. Just wondering where we'll put the Pierces during the presentation. Front and center, of course. The family foundation just donated another $20 million to the Renaissance wing restoration. The wing you've been begging for funding for, remember? Ellie nodded numbly. Of course. Alexander hadn't been interested in Renaissance art by coincidence. His family owned half the museum. Hours later, dressed in the mandatory black cocktail dress that marked her as staff rather than a guest, Ellie stood in the reception line. Her job was simple: smile, offer program booklets, and direct guests to the main hall. She just hadn't expected to be doing it with a knot in her stomach. "You look like you're awaiting execution," whispered Marcus, a fellow curator stationed beside her. "Just tired," Ellie lied, "and not looking forward to watching the 1% congratulate themselves on their generosity while drinking champagne. That costs more than my rent." Marcus grinned. "Cynicism looks good on you, Morgan, but heads up, Pierce party incoming." Ellie's heart thudded as she spotted Alexander stepping out of a sleek black limousine. He was devastating in a tuxedo, his confident stride making other men appear slouched by comparison. Beside him walked an older couple, his parents, she presumed, and trailing slightly behind was a striking blonde woman whose diamond earrings probably cost more than Ellie's entire education. Victoria Huntington, the fiancée. Ellie averted, her gaze hoping to become invisible, but as luck would have it, Alexander headed directly toward her section of the receiving line. "Good evening and welcome to," Ellie began automatically. "Ellie," Alexander interrupted, genuine pleasure lighting his face. "You clean up nicely." Victoria Huntington gave him a curious look, then extended a manicured hand toward Ellie. "Victoria Huntington. And you are?" "Ellie Morgan." "Junior curator," Ellie replied stiffly, shaking Victoria's hand with perhaps more force than necessary. "Congratulations on your engagement." Alexander's smile faltered. "That's not—" "Alexander, darling," his mother interrupted. "The director is waiting to show us the new acquisitions before the announcement." With a complicated look at Ellie, Alexander allowed himself to be steered away, whispering over his shoulder, "Find me later. Please." Ellie stood frozen, program booklets clutched in white-knuckled hands. The nerve of that man. "Did Alexander Pierce just call you by name?" Marcus gaped. "And ask you to find him later?" "It's not what you think," Ellie muttered. "It never is. With the rich ones." Marcus sighed. "Trust me, I dated a hedge fund manager once. Disaster." Inside the grand hall, Alexander was performing his duties with practiced charm while his mind raced. Ellie thought he was engaged, which technically, according to his father and the press release, he was. But he hadn't agreed to anything yet. Certainly hadn't proposed to Victoria, who seemed as reluctant about this arrangement as he was. "Your father tells me you're quite the art enthusiast," Victoria said when they had a moment alone. Her tone was polite, but distant. "I appreciate beauty in all forms," Alexander replied diplomatically. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "Including junior curators and receiving lines?" Alexander stiffened. "I didn't realize I was under surveillance." "Hardly." Victoria sipped her champagne. "But if we're going to endure this charade, we should at least be honest with each other. I have no desire to marry you, Alexander. The feeling is mutual," he assured her. "So why are you going along with it?" "Because my family's bank is hemorrhaging money after some questionable investments in the Asian markets," Victoria admitted, bluntly. "We need this merger as much as your father wants it, but that doesn't mean I intend to give up my life." She nodded subtly toward a tall man across the room, a famous symphony conductor if Alexander recalled correctly. "Ah," Alexander said, understanding dawning. "You have your own reasons to oppose this arrangement." "As do you, apparently," Victoria countered, glancing meaningfully toward the entrance where Ellie stood. "I just met her," Alexander said defensively. "And yet you looked at her with more interest than you've shown me all evening," Victoria noted. "Not that I mind. This could work to our advantage." "How so?" Victoria leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. What if we found a way to make this merger happen without the marriage? Give our parents what they want without sacrificing our futures? For the first time that evening, Alexander felt a genuine connection with Victoria Huntington. I'm listening. Meanwhile, Ellie had been reassigned to champagne duty, circulating through the crowd with a tray of bubbling flutes. She was actively avoiding the main area where Alexander and his party held court, instead focusing on the quieter corners where lesser donors mingled. "You've been staring at Pierce for 20 minutes, Kate whispered as they crossed paths near the catering station. Kate had managed to get assigned to the gala as waitstaff and had been shooting Ellie meaningful looks all evening. "I have not," Ellie protested. "I've been very professionally ignoring him and his fiancée." "His what now?" "Victoria Huntington. They're announcing their engagement tonight, apparently," Kate frowned. "That's weird because he's heading this way right now, and fancy fiancé is nowhere in sight." Before Ellie could escape, Alexander appeared beside her, smoothly taking a champagne flute from her tray. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "I don't fraternize with engaged patrons," Ellie replied, her tone frosty. "That's the thing, I'm not engaged." Ellie laughed sharply. "Really? So that announcement your family is about to make is, what? Merger celebration?" "Essentially, yes," Alexander said. "It's complicated. It always is with men like you," Ellie hissed, conscious of nearby guests who might overhear. "Let me simplify it. I'm working. Go back to your fiancé." "5 minutes," Alexander pleaded. "In the Renaissance wing, the one my family is funding." When she hesitated, he added, "Don't you want to know why a tech billionaire knows so much about Botticelli?" That piqued her curiosity despite her better judgment. "5 minutes, then I never want to see you again." 10 minutes later, Ellie found Alexander, standing before a newly restored Botticelli, his back to her as he studied the delicate brushwork. "My mother was a restoration expert," he said without turning, "before she married my father and became a society wife. This was her specialty, Renaissance masters." Ellie moved to stand beside him, professional interest momentarily overriding her anger. "I didn't know that." "Few people do. She gave it up when I was born," Alexander continued. "But she passed her passion on to me. These Saturday mornings, at the Met were our secret escape from my father's world of acquisitions and mergers." "That doesn't explain why you didn't mention your engagement when you invited me here tonight," Ellie pointed out, refusing to be charmed by this glimpse of humanity. Alexander turned to face her fully. "Because I'm not engaged. Not really. My father announced it without my consent as part of a business strategy. Victoria and I met for the first time tonight. And she's okay with being treated like a corporate asset?" "About as okay with it as I am," Alexander admitted. "Which is why we're planning to find another way to satisfy the merger without the marriage." Ellie studied his face, looking for deception but finding only sincerity. And something else. Vulnerability. It was startling on a man who exuded such confidence. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. "Because when I met you at Sullivan's, it was the first real conversation I'd had in years," Alexander said. "No agenda, no family expectations, no business angle. Just connection." Ellie felt her resolve weakening but strengthened it with a reality check. "We live in different worlds, Alexander. You're here as the guest of honor. I'm here serving champagne with a master's degree and student loans. These kinds of stories don't have happy endings. Maybe that's because no one's brave enough to write a different ending," he challenged. "Have dinner with me, a real dinner, not some chance meeting over a service tray." Before Ellie could respond, a commotion erupted from the main hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," the museum director's voice echoed over the PA system. "If I could have your attention for a special announcement from the Pierce and Huntington families." Alexander cursed under his breath. "I need to stop this." "What are you going to do?" Ellie asked, alarmed by the determination in his eyes. "Something impulsive and probably ill-advised," he admitted. "Wish me luck." He squeezed her hand briefly, then strode purposefully toward the main hall, leaving Ellie torn between following him and maintaining her professional boundaries. Curiosity won. She trailed after him, arriving just in time to see Winston Pierce take the podium. Victoria and her parents arranged neatly beside him, with a conspicuously empty spot where Alexander should have been. "Where is Alexander?" Winston hissed to his wife as Ellie slipped into position against the back wall. "I thought he was with you," she whispered back, smiling rigidly for the cameras. Winston's face darkened as he scanned the crowd. Then, spotting Alexander pushing through the gathered guests, he visibly relaxed. "Ah, there's my son now," Winston announced to the crowd. Just in time for our joyous announcement. Alexander reached the podium, kissed his mother's cheek, and then did something that caused gasps to ripple through the audience. He took the microphone from his father's hand. "Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight to support the arts," Alexander began smoothly. "The Met has always held a special place in my heart, thanks to my mother's influence." Winston tried to reclaim the microphone, but Alexander sidestepped him gracefully. "I know many of you came expecting an engagement announcement," Alexander continued. "But Victoria and I have a different announcement to make." Victoria, looking momentarily startled, recovered quickly and joined Alexander at the microphone. "The Huntington-Pierce merger will indeed proceed," she stated clearly, somehow making it sound like this was the plan all along. "But in a more modern arrangement that honors both families' traditions while looking toward the future." Alexander smiled at her gratefully before addressing the crowd again. "Instead of a marriage, we're establishing a joint charitable foundation dedicated to arts education and preservation, using the combined resources of both our families." Whispers erupted throughout the hall. In the back, Ellie watched in astonishment. This wasn't just about avoiding an unwanted engagement. Alexander was actually creating something meaningful from the chaos. "Sometimes the greatest partnerships aren't built on tradition," Alexander concluded, looking directly at Ellie across the crowded room, "but on finding unexpected connections and having the courage to pursue them." Winston Pierce looked like he might explode with rage, but with hundreds of witnesses and press cameras rolling, he had no choice but to smile and clap along with the crowd. As the applause died down and guests returned to their conversations, Alexander made his way through the throng toward Ellie, determination in every step. "So," he said when he reached her, slightly breathless, "about that dinner?" Ellie couldn't help but smile. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen. Is that a yes?" "It's a you're definitely trouble," she replied, "but I'm curious to see what happens next." "So am I," Alexander admitted. "So am I." Alexander Pierce was accustomed to making headlines, but even he had to admit that Pierce heir derails dynasty merger was particularly attention-grabbing. The New York Times business section was slightly more diplomatic, with Pierce and Huntington families pivot to philanthropic partnership. Page 6 naturally focused on the personal angle. Billionaire bachelor still on the market. What really happened at the Met Gala? None of them had the full story, of course. "Your father has called 17 times, James informed Alexander on Sunday morning, as they played tennis at Alexander's private court atop his Tribeca penthouse. "And the Huntington patriarch has threatened to pull out of the merger entirely." Alexander returned James's serve with perhaps more force than necessary. "Victoria's handling her family. I'll handle mine." "And how exactly are you planning to handle yours?" James asked, missing the return and wiping sweat from his brow. "Because Winston Pierce isn't exactly known for his understanding nature." Alexander paused, bouncing the tennis ball thoughtfully. "I'm taking the museum curator to dinner tonight. The junior curator my family's donation is essentially funding." James groaned. "Tell me you're not serious." "Perfectly serious, and I need you to make a reservation at Lumiere, the private dining room. The 3-month waiting list Lumiere? The one where celebrities get turned away Lumiere?" Alexander smiled. "That's the one." Across town, Ellie was experiencing her own version of fallout. "You've been summoned," Marcus announced dramatically, barging into the tiny office Ellie shared with 3 other junior curators. He slapped a museum memo onto her desk. Director's office ASAP. Ellie's stomach dropped. Is this about Friday night? You mean the gala where Alexander Pierce torpedoed a billion-dollar merger announcement and then spent the rest of the night staring at you? No, couldn't possibly be related. Marcus teased, then grew serious. But seriously, Elle, be careful. The Pierces don't play around when it comes to their money or their reputation. The museum director, Dr. Abernathy, was a formidable woman in her 60s who had navigated the treacherous waters of museum politics for decades. When Ellie entered her office, she found not only Dr. Abernathy, but also Winston Pierce himself, looking considerably less charming than his son. Ms. Morgan, Dr. Abernathy began, her tone carefully neutral. Mr. Pierce has some questions about the Renaissance Wing restoration project. As our resident expert, I thought you could address his concerns directly. Winston Pierce's arctic gaze assessed Ellie. I understand you've become acquainted with my son. Ellie straightened her spine. We've met briefly, yes, through my work at the museum. Among other places, Winston countered smoothly. Sullivan's Bar, for instance. Dr. Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. Mr. Pierce, Ellie said carefully, if you're concerned about the restoration project, I can assure you we're following all the protocols your family foundation outlined in the grant agreement. I'm more concerned about my son's sudden interest in Renaissance art, Winston replied coldly. A passion that conveniently emerged just as our merger negotiations reached a critical stage. Ellie felt heat rising in her cheeks, from anger, not embarrassment. With all due respect, sir, your son demonstrated a deep knowledge of the subject that couldn't have been acquired overnight. If he's interested in art, perhaps you should ask him about it directly. Winston's eyes narrowed. Let me be clear, Ms. Morgan. The Pierce family has ambitious plans for both the museum and our technology empire. Plans that require certain arrangements. My son may be temporarily distracted, but he will fulfill his obligations to this family. Again, sir, these seem like conversations you should have with Alexander, Ellie replied, struggling to maintain her professional tone. The tension was broken by Dr. Abernathy's deliberate throat clearing. Perhaps we should return to the restoration questions? The humidity controls in the new wing need Mr. Pierce's approval before we proceed. After an excruciating 20 minutes of technical discussion, during which Winston barely looked at the plans, Ellie was finally dismissed. As she reached the door, Winston called after her. Ms. Morgan, my son is taking you to dinner tonight, isn't he? Ellie froze. How did you? I know everything that happens in my family, Winston stated matter-of-factly. A word of advice, don't mistake my son's rebellious phase for anything meaningful. When the time comes, he'll do what's necessary for the Pierce legacy. Ellie left the office shaking, with rage, with uncertainty, but most troublingly with the doubt. What was she getting herself into? Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Unknown. Dinner tonight? I promise not to upend any corporate mergers during the appetizer course. Ellie stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to cancel after the encounter with Winston. Another part, the part that had connected with Alexander over Botticelli and defied expectations, wanted to see where this could go. Ellie, I don't own anything appropriate for wherever billionaires eat dinner. The response came immediately. Alexander, wear whatever makes you comfortable. Though fair warning, I've reserved the private room at Lumiere. Ellie nearly dropped her phone. Lumiere was the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, the kind of place where even having money wasn't enough to get a table. You needed to be somebody, Ellie. Reschedule for somewhere normal people eat. I can't walk into Lumiere wearing department store clothes. Another quick reply. Alexander, you could wear a potato sack and still be the most interesting person there. But if it makes you uncomfortable, name your favorite restaurant instead. Ellie smiled despite herself. This was her chance to level the playing field. Ellie, Kim's Noodle House, Chinatown, 8 p.m. No reservations, no private rooms, just the best dumplings in NYC. There was a longer pause before his reply came through. Alexander. Intriguing. I haven't eaten anywhere without a reservation since college. See you at 8. Kim's noodle house was exactly as Ellie had described. A hole in the wall with plastic chairs, fluorescent lighting, and a line out the door. Alexander arrived at 7:55, having convinced his driver that yes, this was indeed the correct address, and no, he didn't need security for dumplings. He spotted Ellie waiting outside wearing jeans, a simple blouse, and a denim jacket. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with designer labels or carefully styled hair. It was the confidence, he realized, the way she stood in a space where she belonged, rather than one where she was tolerated as his guest. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I said I would," Alexander replied, suddenly conscious of his Italian loafers and cashmere sweater. "Though I'm clearly overdressed." Ellie laughed. "Probably the first time you've ever said that." "First time for many things lately," he admitted, following her into the crowded restaurant. The owner, Mrs. Kim herself, greeted Ellie like family, rapidly speaking a mix of English and Mandarin that Ellie somehow understood enough to respond to. No one recognized Alexander, or if they did, they didn't care. It was refreshingly anonymous. They were seated at a small table near the kitchen, so close to the next diners that conversation required leaning in, a proximity that might have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. "Order for us," Alexander suggested. "I trust you." Ellie raised an eyebrow. Brave words for a man who probably hasn't eaten street food since prep school. "I'll have you know I attended a very progressive prep school that regularly took us on cultural enrichment trips to ethnic restaurants," Alexander countered with a self-deprecating smile. "Carefully vetted and reserved entirely for our class." Of course, Ellie laughed, then ordered in fluent Mandarin, earning an approving nod from Mrs. Kim. "Where did you learn Mandarin?" Alexander asked, impressed. "I spent a year in Beijing studying art conservation techniques," Ellie explained. "My scholarship barely covered tuition, so I lived with a local family and learned the language by necessity." "You're full of surprises, Ellie Morgan," says the billionaire tech mogul who can identify a Botticelli restoration at 50 paces, she countered. As steaming baskets of dumplings and noodles arrived at their table, they fell into easy conversation. Alexander described his childhood Saturdays with his mother, learning to identify brush techniques and pigment compositions when other kids his age were watching cartoons. Ellie shared stories of crawling through dusty archives in Florence, tracking down the provenance of disputed masterpieces. "What did your father say after the gala?" Ellie finally asked, the question that had been hanging between them all evening. Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "He reminded me of my responsibilities to the family in colorful and creative ways. Then he threatened to remove me from the board if I didn't reconsider the Victoria arrangement." "And will you reconsider?" "I mean," Alexander met her gaze directly. "My father built Pierce Technologies through acquisitions and strategic partnerships. He sees the world as assets to be leveraged. I want to build something different." "Like the Arts Foundation you announced?" "That was just the beginning." Alexander leaned forward, his voice lighting with genuine passion. "I've been developing a technology incubator for artists, tools that blend traditional techniques with digital innovations. My father sees it as a distraction from our core business. I see it as the future." "That actually sounds amazing," Ellie admitted. "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, some vanity project to rehabilitate your Playboy image." Alexander laughed. "Fair assumption. I've given the press plenty of material." "Speaking of press," Ellie hesitated. "Your father came to the museum today to see me." Alexander's expression shifted from amusement to concern. "What? Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "I'm telling you now," Ellie pointed out. "He made it very clear that you'd eventually fulfill your obligations to the family, whatever that means. It means he's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. Alexander sighed. I'm sorry he dragged you into this. Am I just a pawn in your rebellion against Daddy? Ellie asked bluntly. Is that what you think? I think I'm trying to understand why Alexander Pierce is eating $40 dumplings with me when he could be at Lumiere with, well, anyone. Alexander considered her for a long moment. When you grow up with everything, people stop saying no to you. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny. They agree with opinions they don't share. They want proximity to what you represent, not who you are. He reached across the table, his fingers lightly brushing hers. You called me out on my engagement before I could explain. You made me eat in a restaurant without a Michelin star. You're not impressed by the Pierce name or fortune. Do you know how rare that is in my world? So I'm a novelty, Ellie concluded, withdrawing her hand slightly. You're real, Alexander corrected, and I haven't felt this real in a very long time. The sincerity in his voice caught Ellie off guard. This wasn't the smooth charm of a practiced playboy. This was something else, something vulnerable and genuine that made her heart beat faster despite her better judgment. We still live in different worlds, she reminded him softly. Then maybe it's time I explored yours, Alexander suggested. Starting with, he glanced at Mrs. Kim, who was watching them with undisguised interest. Dessert? Does this place have dessert? Ellie smiled. Red bean buns. You'll either love them or hate them. I'm willing to risk it, Alexander declared. I'm finding that the best things in life often involve risk. As Mrs. Kim brought over the steaming buns, smiling knowingly at the pair, Ellie realized she was taking a risk too. A risk that was either the beginning of something wonderful or the setup for heartbreak. But looking at Alexander Pierce, billionaire, heir, and surprisingly genuine human being, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Not yet anyway. What she didn't know was that across town, Winston Pierce was making calls that would test just how real this connection could be. If there was one thing Winston Pierce understood, it was leverage. In business, leverage meant knowing exactly what your opponent valued most and then controlling it. In family matters, the principle was essentially the same. You've pulled every financial record on Ellie Morgan? He asked his head of security, a former FBI agent who now managed the Pierce family's more sensitive matters. Everything from her student loan debt to her monthly Metro card purchases. The man confirmed, sliding a folder across Winston's desk. She's drowning in debt from her master's program. Her apartment building in Queens is scheduled for renovation, code for raising the rent beyond what she can afford. And her mother in Philadelphia has some medical issues that insurance only partially covers. Winston nodded appreciatively. Financial pressure points. Good. What about professional vulnerabilities? Her position at the Met is grant-funded, renewed annually. The current funding cycle ends in 2 months. Winston smiled thinly. And remind me, who chairs the committee that approves those grants? The Pierce Foundation, sir. Specifically, you. Excellent. Winston closed the folder. Now, what's my son been up to since the gala fiasco? He's seen Ms. Morgan 3 times in the past week. Dinner at a restaurant in Chinatown, a private viewing of new acquisitions at the museum, and most recently, he took her to that technology art installation in Brooklyn, the one his incubator is funding. Winston's jaw tightened. He's showing her his pet project. This is worse than I thought. He swiveled in his chair, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline, a concrete kingdom that he had helped build, and that his son was meant to inherit. Alexander had always been brilliant but restless, too interested in creative pursuits and not focused enough on the bottom line. The Huntington merger was supposed to provide stability, to anchor Alexander to his responsibilities through marriage to a woman who understood their world. This museum curator was a complication Winston hadn't anticipated, and complications required elimination. Set up a meeting with the Met's Board of Trustees, Winston instructed, and prepare a press release about a new Pierce Foundation initiative focusing on educational opportunities abroad. Something that might interest an ambitious young curator. His security chief nodded, understanding the implied directive. And if that doesn't resolve the situation? Winston turned back to his desk. Then we moved to more direct measures. My son needs to remember what's at stake. You're seeing him. Again tonight? Kate squealed, sprawled across Ellie's bed while Ellie rummaged through her closet. That's the 4th time in 10 days. This is officially a thing. It's not a thing, Ellie protested, though her flushed cheek suggested otherwise. It's just interesting conversation with someone who happens to be a billionaire. Uh-huh. And does this interesting conversation involve kissing yet? Ellie threw a pillow at her friend. That is none of your business. But the truth was, despite the chemistry crackling between them, Alexander had been surprisingly old-fashioned. Their good night at her door after the Chinatown dinner had ended with a kiss on her cheek. After the museum private viewing, he'd held her hand as they walked through the darkened galleries, but gone no further. And after the technology exhibition in Brooklyn, he'd brushed his lips against hers so briefly, she'd almost wondered if she'd imagined it. It was as if he was being deliberately careful, testing each step before taking another. Earth to Ellie. Kate waved a hand in front of her face. You were totally thinking about him just now. I was thinking about what to wear, Ellie lied, pulling out a simple black dress. He's taking me to some charity thing at Lincoln Center. Kate sat up, suddenly serious. You know this is going to get complicated, right? The media will notice eventually. Your mysterious billionaire has his photo taken whenever he sneezes. We're being discreet, Ellie said, though she'd had the same concerns. So far, they'd managed to avoid public scrutiny by meeting in private, spaces or less fashionable neighborhoods. But a Lincoln Center charity event was different. Besides, it's not like we're announcing anything, we're just getting to know each other. Kate gave her a skeptical look. And his father? Any more unexpected visits? Not since that day in the director's office. Ellie frowned. Though, Dr. Abernathy has been acting strange lately. Very formal in our meetings when she used to be almost mentorly. That's not concerning at all, Kate muttered. Ellie's phone buzzed with a text. That's Alexander. His driver is downstairs. A driver? How pedestrian, Kate teased. I expected a helicopter at least. Very funny. Don't wait up. Ellie grabbed her small clutch purse and headed for the door. I want details tomorrow, Kate called after her. All the details. Downstairs, a sleek black car waited, the driver holding the door open with practiced deference. Alexander sat inside, looking devastating in a classic tuxedo. You look beautiful, he said as she slid in beside him. You don't clean up too badly yourself, Ellie replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious in her simple dress. Though I'm still not sure I belong at a Lincoln Center gala. Alexander took her hand. You belong wherever you want to be, Ellie. Besides, this is technically a work event for you. The foundation that's being honored tonight funds arts education in underserved communities. Sounds worthwhile, Ellie said, then noticed Alexander's slight smile. What? It's the new initiative I've been developing through our family foundation, he explained. Art and technology education for students who wouldn't otherwise have access. Ellie felt a surge of genuine admiration. That's amazing, Alexander. Truly. I wanted you to see it, he admitted. I value your opinion, professionally and personally. The sincerity in his voice made something flutter in Ellie's chest. Over the past week and a half, she'd discovered layers to Alexander Pierce that she never expected. His genuine passion for democratizing art, his surprisingly deep knowledge of conservation techniques, his dry humor about the absurdities of wealth. Each revelation made it harder to maintain her emotional distance. There's something else, Alexander said as the car approached Lincoln Center. My father will be there tonight. Ellie tensed. Does he know I'm coming with you? I didn't tell him, but he has ways of finding things out, Alexander said grimly. I'm not hiding you, Ellie. I'm just trying to control the narrative. The narrative being that I'm serious about this initiative and about you. His eyes held hers, their intensity both thrilling and terrifying. Alexander, she began carefully, We've known each other less than 2 weeks. I'm not sure what serious means in this context. It means I'm not interested in what my father wants for me, he replied. It means I'm exploring what I want. And right now, that includes spending time with you, without apology or pretense. The car stopped before Ellie could respond. Cameras flashed as they approached the entrance. Not paparazzi, thankfully. Just the event's official photographers documenting donors and guests. "Ready?" Alexander asked, offering his arm. Ellie took a deep breath and nodded. "As I'll ever be." Inside, the gala was in full swing. The elite of New York society mingled with educators and artists, creating an unusual but vibrant mix. Alexander was immediately pulled into conversations with donors and board members, but he kept Ellie at his side, introducing her as the Met's Renaissance restoration expert, who's been consulting on our program. It was a diplomatic designation that acknowledged her professional credentials while avoiding any personal connection that might spark gossip. Ellie appreciated his discretion, though a tiny part of her wondered if he was ashamed to be seen with someone from her world. "Alexander," a familiar cold voice interrupted them mid-conversation with a school principal. "I was hoping to speak with you before the presentation." Winston Pierce stood before them, impeccably dressed and imposingly tall. His eyes barely flicked to Ellie before dismissing her presence entirely. "Father," Alexander greeted him with practiced civility. "You remember Ellie Morgan from the Met?" "Of course," Winston said without warmth. "Ms. Morgan, would you excuse us? Family business." It wasn't a request. Ellie nodded and stepped away, moving toward a display of student artwork nearby. She was out of earshot but could still observe their body language. Alexander stiff and defensive, Winston leaning in with calculating intensity. "Quite a spectacle, isn't it?" A cultured female voice commented beside her. The Pierce men at odds. Ellie turned to find Victoria Huntington studying the same scene, elegant in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than Ellie's annual salary. "Ms. Huntington," Ellie acknowledged, unsure whether Victoria was an ally or adversary. "Victoria, please," she corrected smoothly. "After all, we're both participants in the great Pierce family drama." Ellie bristled slightly. "I'm just here as a museum consultant." Victoria laughed, a genuine sound that softened her polished facade. "No one is just anything when it comes to Alexander. He doesn't operate that way." She sipped her champagne. "Winston is giving him the ultimatum right now." "What ultimatum?" "The foundation that funds your position at the Met is up for renewal soon," Victoria explained, watching understanding dawn on Ellie's face. "You didn't know. The Pierce Foundation provides the grant that pays your salary." Ellie felt her stomach drop. "That's not possible. That grant comes from the National Arts Preservation Fund, which is primarily funded by, you guessed it, the Pierce family," Victoria confirmed. "Winston is making it clear to Alexander that his continued rebellion has consequences beyond his own comfort. He would cut funding to an entire museum program just to control his son?" Ellie asked, horrified. "Winston Pierce didn't build an empire by being sentimental," Victoria said matter-of-factly. "He's offering Alexander a choice. End whatever this is between you two, or watch your career and those of your colleagues suffer." Ellie struggled to maintain her composure as the implications sank in. It wasn't just her position at risk. The entire restoration department could lose funding, because she'd had the audacity to interest Alexander Pierce. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. Victoria considered this. "Perhaps because I know what it's like to be a pawn in Winston's games, or perhaps because Alexander deserves better than his father's manipulation." She placed her empty glass on a passing server's tray. "Or maybe I'm just enjoying the drama from a safe distance now that I'm no longer the leading lady." Before Ellie could respond, Alexander returned, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "Everything okay?" Ellie asked quietly. "Fine," he replied automatically, then seemed to reconsider. "Actually, no, it's not fine. We need to talk, but not here." Victoria raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. I was just leaving. Alexander, always. A pleasure, Ms. Morgan. Good luck, you'll need it. As Victoria walked away, Alexander turned to Ellie. What did she say to you? That your father is threatening the museum's funding because of me, Ellie said bluntly. Is that true? Alexander's silence was answer enough. I need some air, Ellie said, moving toward the terrace. Doors. Outside, the night air was cool against her flushed skin. The Lincoln Center fountain created a soothing backdrop as she tried to process what was happening. Alexander followed her out, loosening his bow tie in a gesture of frustration. I was going to tell you. When? Ellie demanded. After I lost my job? After my entire department was disbanded? That's not going to happen, Alexander insisted. I won't let it. How exactly are you going to stop it? Your father controls the foundation. I have resources of my own, Alexander countered. I could fund the program independently if necessary. Ellie stared at him in disbelief. Do you not see how crazy this is? You can't just throw money at every problem. Why not? Money is the weapon my father is using. Why shouldn't I use the same tactics? Because this isn't about tactics, Alexander. This is about my life, my career, real things that exist outside of your family's power struggles. Alexander ran a hand through his hair in frustration. What do you want me to do, Ellie? Walk away? Pretend the past 2 weeks never happened? The pain in his voice made her hesitate. Against all logic, against her better judgment, she'd begun to care deeply for this man who lived in a world so different from hers. But at what cost? I want you to understand that I can't be the reason people lose their jobs, she said finally. I won't be a pawn in this game between you and your father. You're not a pawn, Alexander insisted, stepping closer. You're the reason I'm finally standing up for what I want instead of what's expected of me. And what is it you want exactly? Ellie challenged. Alexander's gaze held hers steadily. A chance to find out if what I feel for you is real. A chance to build something that isn't defined by the Pierce name or fortune. The sincerity in his voice was almost enough to make her forget the impossible situation they were in. Almost. Alexander, she said softly, we live in different universes. Your father just demonstrated exactly how unequal this relationship is. He can destroy my career with a phone call. So we fight him together, Alexander urged. I have the resources, Ellie. I can protect you. I don't want to be protected, she countered. I want to stand on my own. And I can't do that if my professional reputation is tied to whether or not I'm dating Alexander Pierce. The word dating hung between them, the first time either had put a label on what they were doing. So that's it? Alexander asked, his voice tight. You're ending this before it even begins because of what might happen. Ellie felt tears threatening and fought them back. I'm saying we need to be realistic. Your world has rules and consequences. I never had to consider before. I need time to think about whether I can navigate this. Alexander was silent for a long moment. My father gave me an ultimatum tonight, he finally said. End things with you, or he dismantles my technology, arts initiative, and cuts funding to the museum. What did you tell him? Ellie asked, though she already knew the answer from his presence beside her. I told him he doesn't get to choose who's in my life anymore, Alexander said simply. And then I walked away. The weight of his choice settled between them. For a man who had everything, walking away from his father's empire was perhaps the only meaningful sacrifice he could make. Alexander, Ellie began, not sure what she was going to say, but knowing she needed to say something. He stopped her with a gentle finger to her lips. Don't decide tonight. Just know that whatever you choose, I've already made my choice. For once in my life, I'm choosing something real over something convenient. Inside, the orchestra began playing, signaling the start of the program where Alexander was supposed to present his initiative. A choice loomed there too: return to his public duties or stay with her in this moment of raw honesty. You should go back in, Ellie said softly. They're waiting for you. Alexander hesitated, then nodded. Will you wait for me? After the presentation? It was a loaded question. Not just about tonight, but about everything that might come after. I'll be here, Ellie promised, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was promising. As Alexander walked back inside, shoulders squared and resolve evident in his stride, Ellie turned to the fountain, its waters catching the city lights in a dance of color and movement. Just like her heart, turbulent, beautiful, and completely unpredictable. What she didn't see was Winston Pierce watching from a window above, his expression calculating as he made a phone call that would change everything. Ellie Morgan had never been fired before. She'd quit jobs, outgrown positions, and strategically advanced her career through careful moves. But being called into Dr. Abernathy's office on a Monday morning and informed that her grant funding had been unexpectedly redirected was a new experience. I don't understand, Ellie said, her voice impressively steady despite the panic rising in her chest. The renewal was practically guaranteed. We're in the middle of the Botticelli restoration. Dr. Abernathy looked genuinely distressed. The board received a call on Friday night. The Pierce Foundation is restructuring its philanthropic priorities. She hesitated. Ellie, I have to ask, is there something going on between you and Alexander Pierce? The timing is conspicuous. Ellie felt her face burn. We've been spending time together, yes, but I didn't think... She stopped, remembering Winston's cold stare at the Lincoln Center gala. This is because of his father, isn't it? I can't speak to the internal politics of the Pierce family, Dr. Abernathy said diplomatically. But I've never seen a grant withdrawn so abruptly without cause. The board is scrambling to find alternative funding, but in the meantime, I'm unemployed, Ellie finished flatly. You'll receive 2 weeks severance, Doctor, Abernathy offered, as if that would soften the blow. And, of course, a glowing recommendation. Ellie nodded numbly, gathered her few personal belongings from her desk, and walked out of the museum that had been her professional home for the last 3 years. The spring sunshine felt mockingly bright as she stood on the grand steps, wondering what to do next. Her phone buzzed. Alexander, calling for the 5th time that morning. She had been avoiding his calls since the gala, needing space to think. Now, with her career in shambles, she wasn't sure she could speak to him without breaking down. Instead, she texted, "Lost my job. Pierce Foundation pulled funding. Need time." His response was immediate. "I'm coming to you. Where are you?" "No," she replied firmly. "I need to handle this myself first." Before he could respond, she turned off her phone and headed for the subway. She needed clarity, and she knew exactly where to find it. "You did what?" James stared at Alexander across the conference table, where Pierce Technologies' executive team had gathered for their weekly meeting. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. "I've transferred 40% of my personal holdings in Pierce Technologies to an independent trust," Alexander repeated calmly. "The Alexander Pierce Foundation is now a separate entity from the Family Foundation, with its own board and funding structure." James glanced at the other executives, then back at his friend. "Can we have the room, please?" Once they were alone, he continued, "You've completely lost your mind. That's over $10 billion. 11.4 to be exact," Alexander confirmed. "Enough to fund my technology arts initiative independently and to establish a permanent endowment for the Met's Restoration Department. All because your father fired your girlfriend?" Alexander's expression hardened. "Because my father tried to use people's livelihoods as leverage to control my personal life. This ends now. And if Winston retaliates, removes you from the board, cuts you out entirely, then I'll have the resources to build something new," Alexander said with a confidence that surprised even himself. "Something that reflects my values, not his." James studied his friend for a long moment. "This is about more than just the museum curator, isn't it?" Alexander nodded slowly. "Ellie helped me see what I've always known but was afraid to admit. I've been living my life according to my father's blueprint. It's time to draw my own." That's very poetic, James said dryly. But have you considered that you might be throwing away your birthright for a woman you barely know? I'm not throwing anything away, Alexander insisted. I'm building something better, and as for Ellie... He sighed. I don't know what's going to happen there. She needs space, and I'm trying to respect that. But even if she decides this is too complicated, I won't regret standing up to my father. James shook his head in disbelief, but couldn't help smiling slightly. You know, for a billionaire playboy, you've turned out to be surprisingly principled. Don't tell anyone, Alexander quipped. It would ruin my reputation. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. She's at the cloisters, Northern Garden. Go fix this before she leaves the country. V. Victoria. Alexander smiled at the unexpected alliance. I have to go, he told James, already. Heading for the door. If my father calls, tell him I'm building my own empire. The Cloisters Museum sat at the northern tip of Manhattan, a medieval fortress overlooking the Hudson River. It had always been Ellie's sanctuary when she needed perspective. Medieval art had a way of making modern problems seem temporary. She sat in the Northern Garden, surrounded by herbs and flowers cultivated according to medieval manuscripts. Her letter of acceptance to the Florence Conservation Institute lay open on her lap. The fellowship had been her dream job before she settled at the Met, and when she'd reached out to her former professor in desperation, he'd offered her a position immediately. It would mean leaving New York, leaving the complicated mess with Alexander, starting fresh in a city she loved, doing work she was passionate about. The sensible choice was obvious. So why was she hesitating? The medieval monks believed these gardens cured both body and soul, a familiar voice said behind her. Ellie didn't turn around. How did you find me? Victoria, Alexander admitted, sitting beside her on the stone bench. Apparently she's Team Ellie. Despite everything, Ellie smiled slightly. I think she's Team Drama. Probably, Alexander agreed. He noticed the letter in her lap. What's that? A fellowship in Florence. They want me to start next month. Alexander absorbed this, his face carefully neutral. It's a great opportunity. It is, Ellie agreed, and conveniently far from Pierce family politics. Ellie, I'm sorry about the museum. My father did exactly what you predicted he would do, she finished for him. I just didn't think it would happen so quickly. I've established my own foundation, Alexander said, independent from my father's control. I've already reached out to the Met's board about reinstating the restoration department funding. Ellie finally turned to look at him. You can't just throw money at every problem, Alexander. Why not? In this case, money is the solution. People shouldn't lose their jobs because Winston Pierce is having a power struggle with his son. And what about the next time your father disapproves of something you do? Will you create another foundation? Split off another piece of your fortune? That's not sustainable. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Ellie had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. What do you want me to do, Ellie? I'm trying to fix this. That's just it, she said softly. You're trying to fix it like a Pierce, by using resources and influence to reshape reality to suit your preferences. But some things can't be fixed that way. I'm not trying to buy you, Alexander said, hurt evident in his voice. I'm trying to right a wrong. I know, Ellie acknowledged, and it's a generous, well-intentioned gesture. But do you see how unequal that makes things between us? You can solve problems with a phone call that would derail my entire life. So what's the alternative? I pretend I don't have resources? You move to Florence to avoid dealing with the reality of who I am? The bluntness of his question made Ellie pause. He was right. Running away wouldn't solve anything. I don't know what the answer is, she admitted. I just know that I've spent my life working to stand on my own, to earn every opportunity through merit and hard work. And in the span of 2 weeks with you, all of that was undermined by a wealthy man's whim. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, taking in her words. You know, my mother said something similar to my father once. Your mother? The art conservator who gave it all up? Alexander nodded. I always thought she stepped away from her career willingly to focus on family, but recently I found her journals from that time. His voice softened with memory. She wrote about feeling erased by the Pierce name, like her identity had been subsumed into the family brand. She loved my father, but she lost herself. What happened? Ellie asked, genuinely curious. She made a choice, Alexander said simply. She established boundaries, spaces in our life that were just ours, separate from the Pierce empire. Those Saturday mornings at the Met, that was her reclaiming her passion on her own terms. And your father accepted that? Alexander smiled wryly. Not at first. There were epic battles. But eventually, yes. Because he recognized that loving someone means respecting their need for autonomy and identity. And you think your father would respect me the same way? Ellie asked skeptically. Honestly, probably not, Alexander admitted. But I'm not my father, Ellie. I don't want to change who you are or control your choices. I just want the chance to see where this could go without my family's shadow looming over us. Ellie looked down at the Florence acceptance letter, then back at Alexander. I've spent 2 weeks with you and my life is completely derailed. That's terrifying. Terrifying, Alexander agreed, but also exhilarating. At least a little? Despite herself, Ellie laughed. Maybe a little, she conceded, when I'm not having panic attacks about unemployment. For what it's worth, the Met Board is meeting this afternoon to vote on the new funding proposal. Dr. Abernathy seems confident they'll reinstate the entire department. With me included? If you want it, Alexander said carefully. No strings attached. The funding comes with strict governance to prevent any interference from me or my father. Ellie considered this. And if I take the Florence Fellowship instead? Then I'll wish you well and regret that I won't get to know you better, Alexander said, though the tightness in his voice betrayed how difficult that outcome would be for him. But I'll respect your choice. Just like that? No, he admitted. I'll probably mope dramatically and write sad poetry and annoy James with talk of what might have been. But I won't try to stop you or manipulate you into staying. His honesty made Ellie smile again. This is all moving very fast. Welcome to my world, Alexander said. Everything happens at warp speed when there are no financial limitations. It's both a blessing and a curse. I need parameters, Ellie decided suddenly. If I stay, and that's still an if, we need ground rules. Alexander perked up at the possibility. Name them. 1, my career remains separate from your influence. No calling the board, no donations tied to my projects, no pulling strings. Agreed, Alexander said immediately, though the foundation will continue to support the department as a whole. 2, we take this slowly. No moving in together after 3 weeks, no whirlwind proposals, no jet setting around the world, while I'm trying to finish the Botticelli restoration. Define slowly, Alexander countered. Because I'm already halfway in love with you, and pretending otherwise seems disingenuous. Ellie's heart fluttered at the admission, but she steeled herself. Slowly means dinner once or twice a week. Getting to know each other as people, not as characters in some romantic fantasy. Acceptable, though negotiable after appropriate milestones, Alexander said, a hint of his business acumen showing through. 3, Ellie continued. I pay my own way whenever possible. No extravagant gifts, no paying off my student loans without telling me, no mysteriously vanishing bills. Alexander winced slightly. About that, you already paid something off, didn't you? Not exactly, he hedged, but I may have set up a blind scholarship fund for museum professionals with student debt. It's completely independent and merit-based. You could apply if you wanted. Ellie narrowed her eyes. Alexander. Fine, he conceded. No financial heroics, though it physically pains me to know I could solve problems for you with resources that are, frankly, excessive in my life. That's part of the challenge, Ellie pointed out. Learning to connect as equals when our circumstances are anything but equal. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. My mother would like you." "I'd like to meet her someday," Ellie said, realizing as she said it that she was already imagining a future where that might happen. "So," Alexander said cautiously, "does this mean you're staying? Giving us a chance?" Ellie looked at the acceptance, let her one more time, then deliberately folded it and placed it in her bag. "I'm keeping this as an option, but yes, I'm willing to see if we can navigate this complicated situation." Alexander's smile was radiant. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance." He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. "What? About your father?" she asked. "He's not going to be happy about any of this." "Let me worry about Winston," Alexander said confidently. "He's just going to have to accept that the next generation of Pierces will do things differently." "The next generation?" Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Getting ahead of yourself, aren't you?" "Just thinking long term," Alexander said innocently. "It's the businessman in me." As they walked through the cloister's garden, hand in hand, Ellie realized that for all her careful planning and independent spirit, some of the best things in life couldn't be controlled or predicted. Sometimes you just had to take a chance. 1 year later. "I still can't believe you talked me into this," Ellie muttered as she adjusted her gown, a stunning creation by a designer friend of Alexander's who had insisted on making it as a housewarming gift. "It's for charity," Alexander reminded her, straightening his bow tie in the mirror of their hotel suite. "All proceeds go to the Arts Education Initiative." "Yes, but did the charity auction really need to include a dance with Alexander?" "Pierce is a prize, your ego is showing, darling." Alexander grinned unrepentantly. "The dance with me raised $50,000. The dance with you raised $75,000. Your appeal is showing, darling." Ellie blushed. In the year since they'd begun their carefully paced relationship, she'd reluctantly adjusted to life as the partner of one of New York's most eligible bachelors. The media had been predictably intrusive at first, Pierce Ayre's Museum Muse being one of the more cringeworthy headlines, but the novelty had eventually faded. What hadn't faded was their connection. Despite the odds, despite Winston's continued disapproval, though even he had mellowed slightly after seeing his son happier and more engaged in the business than ever before, they had found a way to build something real. Ellie had been promoted to head of the restoration department, a position she had earned through her work on the Botticelli project that had received international acclaim. Alexander had successfully launched his technology arts initiative, now partnering with schools across the country. They had their separate lives and accomplishments, but also a shared vision that somehow made both stronger. "Ready?" Alexander asked, offering his arm. "Ready," Ellie confirmed, taking it. As they entered the ballroom of the Met, where they had first connected over shared passion for Renaissance art, Ellie caught sight of Winston Pierce watching them from across the room. He gave her a curt nod, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. It was progress. "Your father's here," she murmured to Alexander. "I know," he replied. "He donated $1 million to the education program last week, didn't say a word about it to me." "That's unexpected." Alexander smiled. "Not really. He respects success, even when it doesn't follow his blueprint. And what we're building together is undeniably successful." "What exactly are we building?" Ellie asked, genuinely curious how he would define what had developed between them. Alexander thought for a moment. "A partnership, based not on what the world expects from us, but on what we choose for ourselves." "Very philosophical," Ellie teased, but she squeezed his hand to show she understood. "I try," he said modestly, "though I do have one request that might violate our taking it slow agreement." Ellie looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of request?" "The kind that involves Florence," Alexander said casually. "I was thinking we might go there for Christmas, to visit that professor who offered you the fellowship." "Professor Moretti? Why?" "Because I'd like his blessing before I ask you to." "Marry me," Alexander said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his nerves. "He's the closest thing to family you have in the art world, and I know how much his opinion matters to you." Ellie stopped walking, staring at him in shock. "Alexander Pierce, is this a proposal?" "No," he assured her. "When I propose, you'll know it. No ambiguity, no games. But it is," he searched for the right word, "a notice of intent." "A notice of intent?" Ellie laughed. "How romantic." "I thought we were being practical," Alexander countered with a smile. "Isn't that what you wanted? Parameters, planning, proper pacing." "Yes, but maybe some of your practical nature has rubbed off on me and some of my impulsiveness has rubbed off on you," Alexander suggested. "I'm planning ahead, and you're considering marrying a billionaire you once served tequila to. We're both evolving." Ellie shook her head in wonder. "You really think we can make this work long-term? The curator and the billionaire?" "I think we already have," Alexander said simply. "Love on your terms, partnership on equal footing, and a shared passion for building something meaningful together. Sounds like a solid foundation to me." As they moved onto the dance floor for the first dance of the evening, the one they had auctioned off for charity, Ellie had to admit he was right. Against all odds, they had found a way to bridge their two worlds. And as Alexander pulled her close, whispering ideas for their Florence trip that made her blush, Ellie realized some fairy tales didn't need rescuing princes or magical transformations. Sometimes they just needed two people brave enough to write their own story,